I know that everyone who is listening in is familiar with Nikole's work. And really, we're going to center the conversation around her experience leading the 1619 Project. It is the initiative the New York Times kind of undertook under Nikole's leadership to reframe US history by placing the consequences of slavery and specifically the contributions of Black Americans at the center of our national narrative. And so I guess first and foremost, Nikole, I just want to thank you again for making the time.
Happy to be here.
Amazing. So our audience is filled with writers who I think all seek to do important work one day. And so I'd love to kind of center this conversation around your journey growing up in a town that I don't know most of us would be able to quite place on a map, to creating one of the most ambitious and impactful pieces of journalism, in recent memory. And so I wanted to kind of start at the very beginning, and I'd love to hear a little bit about Waterloo, Iowa, and maybe some of your earliest experiences growing up there.
Okay, great. So Waterloo, Iowa is in Northeast Iowa. It is a small city, about 70,000 people or so, which is a big city for Iowa. I think it's maybe fifth largest city in Iowa. But it was also a landing spot for the Great Migration. So the same train line, the Illinois Central line that brought Black people from Mississippi to Chicago came through my hometown. And that's how my family and nearly all the Black families there ultimately ended up in Waterloo. And so Waterloo is about 15% Black in a state that is not even 2% Black. So it's Blacker than the country, which surprises a lot of people. And it's the Blackest city in the state. So I grew up there. It's very working class. It's a blue collar labor union town. Most people could get decent work in meatpacking plants, if you call that decent, I guess, work that pays at least a living wage, in meatpacking plants, in John Deere factory, that sort of thing. And that's the community that I grew up in. My dad was a military veteran. He was in the Army before I was born. And when he got out of the Army, worked a lot of kind of service jobs, but my dad was an avid reader. And some of my earliest memories are reading the daily newspaper every day with my dad, the Waterloo Courier, and he also subscribed to our state paper, the Des Moines Register, and we read the paper almost every day together. So I've been interested in news and reading news for pretty much as long as I can remember, and I got my first letter to the editor published in 1988 when I was 11 years old.
Oh, that's amazing. I don't think I heard that story. So you really did start young. And actually, that was something I was really curious to hear about, is maybe some of those folks early on in Waterloo were just generally who ended up being very impactful in maybe in hindsight now with the work that you do now. I'm curious to hear about maybe who some of those figures were in those earlier days who nudged you down this path.
Yeah, I certainly, so I was part of a school desegregation, a voluntary school desegregation program in my hometown. There weren't a lot of Black folks, but there was still enough to segregate us. And so starting in the second grade to the 12th grade, I was bused along with a small number of other Black kids to the other side of town to go to white schools. And my high school was about 20% Black, and almost all of the kids in my high school were also bused in as part of this desegregation program. So I would say the person who probably had the biggest impact ultimately on my deciding to become a journalist and my interest in Black history specifically was my high school teacher, Mr. Ray Dial. And Mr. Dial taught a one semester Black Studies elective, and that's when I first came across the date 1619. So in that one semester, I learned more about Black history and Black people than I'd learned my entire career. And I became fairly obsessed with that history. And so being a very nerdy child, which is clear from the fact that I got a letter to the editor published when I was 11 about the Iowa primary, I would ask him to give me books to read, and I would read books on my own. And one of the books he gave me was Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett. And that's when I came across the date 1619 and was just really struck. No one had ever taught me that date. No one had ever taught us that Black people had been here that long, that slavery had been here that long. So even as like a high schooler, I really understood the power of erasure, and that the facts we're taught in school are not all the facts that we could know. They're curated facts that someone has chosen for us to know. And he was also the teacher who encouraged me to join my high school paper. So I came to Mr. Dow one day and I complained about how our high school paper never wrote about kids like me, all the Black kids, bused into a school out of our own neighborhoods where we never felt like we really belonged. And as a great educator will do, he told me to join the paper or shut up and don't come in his classroom complaining about it anymore. So that's what I did. And I had a column called From the African Perspective, and I wrote about Black kids and our experience. And I won my first journalism award from the Iowa High School Press Association for a column I did about the stereotypes that Black students who were bused into the school faced. So he, a lot of people had an impact on me in Waterloo, but kind of, if you want to see, the impact on me starting to think about my life in a certain way, it would certainly be Mr. Dow.
Yeah, and one kind of just fascinating thing I've heard you share pretty generously is your story, specifically on your mother's side of the family, and maybe your grandparents loved and cared for you, but maybe had their own kind of problematic beliefs around race. And one thing I was curious about is just how that dynamic in your family taught, maybe what that kind of taught you about how racism can kind of embed itself in society, even from these people who love you and care for you.
Yeah, so I am Black, but I am also biracial, and my mom is white and my dad is Black. And when my parents got together, so my mom grew up in rural Iowa, never grew up around any Black people at all, and met my dad when she came to the adjoining town to my hometown to go to college. And when my parents got together, my grandparents initially disowned my mom and said that they weren't going to support her in going to college anymore or even talk to her anymore as long as she was with a Black man. And it wasn't until my mom got pregnant with my older sister, and that being the first grandchild, that they re-embraced my mom. So I grew up, literally straddling the color line. I grew up where one side of my family, and as you said, my grandparents were wonderful grandparents. They took us on family vacations every year. Some of my best childhood memories are spent, on their land in rural Iowa. They were very supportive of us individually, but they had racial views that were in opposition to the other half of my family. And what it really showed was two things. From a young age, I got to really see how structural inequality worked. My mother's father was born in 1924, a white man in rural Iowa. My father's mother was born in 1924, a Black woman in Greenwood, Mississippi. And as a white man of that era, there was nothing my grandfather couldn't do. He was able to get the money or education to do it. He could go to any school, he could work any job, he could live in any neighborhood. And for my grandmother, it was complete opposite. There was restrictions on everything that she could do just because of what boxes were checked on her birth certificate. So I think having those experiences and seeing that good people can be racist, right? Good people can love a Black person and have Black family. And yet my grandparents were Reagan supporters, they were Bush supporters, they opposed Obama, and were somehow unable to make the connection that like your half Black grandchildren are, Obama represents them and he represents what matters to their lives. And he's passing policies that help the Black side of your family. And they were never, they couldn't make that connection. And I think a lot of times when we think about racists, we want to think about someone wearing a Klan hood or someone who could never have intimate relationships with Black people. And that's just not how it works. So that understanding is certainly always from a young age led me to question systems and narratives because I was living in between both of those.
Yeah, and that's something, and I know a lot of folks who are listening and now and who will listen to this later have read so much of your work, but I think that is one of the many, many things I so deeply, found profound about the 1619 Project, which is just seeing how deeply embedded many of these belief systems can be and these power structures can be in a way that's very elusive and people try and wiggle out of. But when you look at the thing, you can no longer ignore it. So I guess I'm curious, kind of leaving high school now, going to college, when did you really determine like I can make a career, writing about this and really make my name and make a contribution to this conversation?
Um, so I wasn't when I graduated high school, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a journalist or a historian, frankly. I loved both of those things, and I only applied to one college, and that was Notre Dame, and Notre Dame did not have a journalism program at that time. They do now. So it was an easy choice in undergrad. I majored in history and African American studies because I couldn't major in journalism. And then I spent 2 years after I graduated really trying to figure out which of those paths I wanted to take, and ultimately decided that I could always use history and study history as a journalist, but that journalists write for the masses. Journalists have the ability to, at our best, change our society, to um, expose things in our society, and hopefully force us to confront those things and change. Where history, of course, is about helping us understand our society, but it's not about the right now. So, and unless you're a history nerd, a lot of Americans clearly that I think that's been borne out in the reaction to the 1619 Project, don't spend a lot of time reading history. So I really wanted to do work that I thought could make a difference in our society moving forward. And I knew that there's some Black journalists who say they just wanted to be a journalist, but I always wanted to write about race. Like, being Black has always defined why I wanted to become a journalist, the way I wanted to tell stories. But I frankly didn't think I would make a name for myself. I really never thought anyone would ever know my name. I just wanted to write about Black folks in the South. I really wanted to write for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which, they never hired me, so I never got that chance. But I didn't have, I was a kid from Waterloo, Iowa, from a working class family. I didn't know journalists growing up. I didn't even read bylines. I just read news stories. Like, there was so much I didn't know about the industry that I didn't have these big ambitions. And frankly, I never even applied to the New York Times. Even once I was fairly established, once I was at ProPublica, the Times reached out to me, or I wouldn't be at the Times, because I would have never applied there. I would have never thought, even when I was at ProPublica, that the Times would hire someone like me. So it wasn't so much that I determined at some point I would make a name for myself, but I just knew, I felt like my purpose was to do journalism about race and Black Americans.
Yeah, it's actually something I was really curious to ask you. Like, when you look back at some of these career transitions you've made, how do you kind of explain the pull that a lot of institutions now have, and why is it that folks have really sought you out and you haven't had to necessarily, even these maybe opportunities you wouldn't have dreamed of when you were younger? Um, I'm curious to hear your stories of being pulled into these larger organizations that, you know, hopefully helped give you a platform and invest in your work more, because I can imagine it's often felt like an uphill battle.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I'm 45 years old, so I was working in journalism for nearly 2 decades before, not quite 2 decades, but 15 years before the Times hired me. So no, it's not a story of these, institutions like the Times recognizing my talent or whatever from a young age. I mean, I was grinding. I was a beat reporter working my way. I started at a twice weekly newspaper, worked my way to a slightly larger daily paper, to another larger daily paper, and was covering every type of beat and really just honing, my skills as a reporter. I think what made me start to stand out, though, are two things. One, I always have read and studied history. And so whenever I was doing reporting on racial inequality, I was always filling it in with, I was doing all of this research, even archival research. So I was never just telling stories about today. I was saying, oh, you want to talk about, this bill that's going to affect gentrification? Well, let me tell you exactly all of the things that led to this gentrification. Let me tell you all of these racial policies. And then I also was really determined to prove that you could treat racial inequality as an investigative beat. We have largely in this country treated, the race beat or journalism about race as just this, I call it the cataloging of maladies, reporting that is very superficial and basically just says that Black people suffer from all of these things, without ever getting to the how and the who, and that there are people who are responsible right now, who make decisions right now, and that you can treat this as an investigative beat. And that really has been, when I finally got the chance to do this like investigations long time at ProPublica, that was the hallmark of my work there, was taking these kind of deeply entrenched societal issues like housing segregation, and not simply saying housing segregation exists, but, oh, actually, I'm going to FOIA HUD. I'm going to FOIA how cities are spending these, federal grants that are tied to housing integration. I'm going to actually show that there were a bunch of people who decided they were never going to enforce the Fair Housing Act. And that, to me, is where I started to get them the notice and the bigger platform. Was my reporting just stood out because I was treating racial inequality as a beat that you could treat as an accountability investigative beat. But that was, years and years. And I got to the Times a lot older and a lot later than a lot of other people. I, also was nearly pushed out of the industry before I came to New York, when I was working at the Oregonian, because they didn't value the type of reporting that I wanted to do. I think it's important, I'm not sure kind of where in people's career are the audience for this, but it's not a, overnight success. It's not a, easy way where people just realize my brilliance, whatever brilliance I may have. But it was a grind. I worked 2 jobs till I was 30 years old. I was a journalist and selling mattresses on the side. It was not inevitable that I would get here.
Yeah, I remember you sharing some of your time at the Oregonian, and falling back on journalism is really a calling, as maybe
Yes.
helping to dig deep. And that was something I was curious to ask you, is just in those moments of strife, or just where you've really felt like, is anything going to come of this in some cosmic sense? Where do you kind of find the motivation to persevere and keep doing the work and keep showing up? Because I think everyone in their own way is thinking through that for their own work.
Yeah, one thing I've never struggled with is to be motivated to do this work. I mean, you said it right. It is a calling for me. The reason that I was not pushed out of the industry was because I literally couldn't think of anything else I was going to do with my life. Like, if I wasn't doing this, I couldn't imagine what I would do with my life. I have a lot of other interests, but this is the most fulfilling work for me that I could possibly imagine. And I'm always, I just feel extremely grateful every day that I get paid to think and talk to people and read. And that if I see something in society that I think is unjust or wrong, I have a platform to say something about that. I can influence how people think. I can shape the debate. And that isn't just at, the big national level. My very first job as an education beat reporter in North Carolina, I was able to do reporting on, teacher inequality in segregated schools and unfair discipline practices that change policy at the local level for real kids. There's nothing like that. There's a lot of jobs. I could have been, at one time in my younger life, I considered being a civil rights attorney. If we weren't a racist country, I'd probably be an interior designer. I have lots of interests, but every single day, I just feel so blessed and grateful that I can do this for a living. And I never struggle for motivation, though I clearly have struggled to be able to do the work that I got into journalism to do. That was a bigger struggle sometimes, with people who didn't appreciate, who didn't think that race should be a primary beat, who thought that my wanting to write about race was biased, who didn't think white readers cared about race, which clearly the 1619 Project has disproven. But that's been the struggle for me in my career, not me finding motivation.
I love that explanation. That's such a powerful reminder of falling back on the things that really, are at your core. So with the 1619 project, which is what I really want to dive into in the remainder of our time here, I just view that as, this great project of significance, obviously, but it carries this weight that I think is far beyond most pieces of writing or, most even big book projects. It's this whole reframe of the history of, the most powerful nation on earth now. And that is not a trivial undertaking. And I'm very curious to hear where the seedling of this project came from, maybe after being in high school and first learning about the year itself.
Um, so in some ways, I do say I've been working towards the 1619 project my entire career. Um, the project, benefits from me reading American history, and particularly American history involving Black people obsessively for 2 decades. If you were at my house, you'll see every book on my shelf is about that. I'm a voracious reader of history, so much to the point that my mom used to send me number one ladies detective agency novels because she's like, you need to lighten up with your reading sometimes. Um, so, 20 years of really thinking and reading and studying this history, but also my work was about modern America, right? I'm writing about segregation in housing right now, segregation in schools right now, criminal justice right now. And I used to joke with my editors that, so all of my pieces usually go back at least 50 years. I'm at least building civil rights history into my pieces. And I used to joke that eventually I was going to get back to slavery, that eventually I was going to write some modern story that got back to slavery. And it was this kind of running joke in my office. And and I've also been, obsessed with the year 1619 since high school. I really have. Everyone who knows me, most Americans had never heard of the date 1619, but all of my friends had heard of the date 1619 because I've always talked about it. So as the anniversary was approaching, and this is like late 2018, I'm just thinking, oh my God, like this monumental 400th anniversary of one of the most, if not the most foundational American institution is approaching, and no one's going to know about it. It's not going to be covered well. It's going to be like so many important anniversaries, just like, the anniversary of the 13th Amendment. We don't, we don't deal with slavery and these commemorations, and we've never really dealt with, as a country, clearly, the connections to how slavery still connects to our present. And I was thinking, and I was like, okay, I could write something, but one essay, it's not going to do what it needs to do, right? How can one person sum this up in one essay? And I had also kind of long said that if you name anything in American life, I can trace it back to slavery. And I was only half joking, just about, it really is just about true. So I just decided to pitch that we should take over the entire issue of the New York Times Magazine and excavate all of the surprising ways in modern American life that they connect back to slavery, and that we would use kind of deep historiography, not to just, because there were other 1619 commemorative projects, but those other projects were really just about, this is what happened a long time ago. Our project was about, this is why our country looks like this right now. This is why capitalism, democracy, politics, like all of these things is like that right now. So that was my idea. And I can't say, because I've been studying and thinking about this for 20 years, I can't just say this was the moment when I knew. But it really was just not wanting this 400th anniversary to pass with most Americans still not having to grapple with the fact that slavery predates almost every other institution in our country.
Yeah, and that was, I love that you've spoken to how you think about a lot of your writing and really grounding it in history in a deeper context, not just maybe reciting facts or not having this deeper why behind certain things. And I
Yeah,
know my impression reading through many of the essays in the project is this indelible sense that this is almost a force in and of itself, not a series of events that unfolded a while ago. That, I love the intentional choice to ground it in the present, not
yeah.
just make it a pure recounting of the past per se. even to the point of, management techniques that they claim, a lot of enlightened books say came from the industrial era.
Mhm.
No, actually root back to how plantations and even that forced labor camps were operated. And I remember just my first impression of so much of this writing was this sense of the deeper systemic, like long lasting arc of history extending right into today. And
Yes.
so I guess this does lead to a question, which is like when you set about with this kind of mission in mind, how did you just think about, I guess, who you're writing this for and how to frame it in a way where it will really land?
Yeah, I I always say there's a difference between who you're writing for and who you're writing to. And I would definitely say I was writing this project for Black Americans specifically, that this was a project where um, I needed to do right by this 400-year history and this erasure and this sense of constant alienation that Black people feel and are made to feel from a country that we played a significant part in building. But who it was to was really all Americans who we've all been robbed of a true understanding of our country because we are taught this history so poorly. And the reason why I always build so much history into my work is, I'm not a hopeful person, and I don't tend to find hope to be a useful emotion, but I do think that so much of the opposition to measures that try to bring about equality is because most Americans just simply have no idea what the institution of slavery was like, that we follow slavery with 100 years of legal discrimination that was undergirded by racial terrorism. They just don't know. Every time someone says, well, every country had slavery, I'm like, oh, you really don't understand what American slavery was like. You don't understand the duration. You don't understand what it's like to know that you and every generation ever born from you will never know a day of freedom. They will be born into slavery where every day they work, everything they earn will belong to someone else. And that the only way that works is by a appalling and barbaric amount of violence, right? So to me, it was believing that, I don't think we'll ever have a nation bent towards equality, but I think it's impossible based on the history that we've been taught. And every Black person in this country hears probably multiple times in your life that slavery was a long time ago. Why don't you get over it? And I really wanted to use this project to show slavery legacy can be seen all throughout our modern society. And we can't get over it because our country hasn't gotten over it, because it is embedded in our institutions. And so I knew there were a few essays I knew had to be in there. And the two were taking on kind of the most important institutions for American identity, which are democracy and capitalism. I knew that I needed to expose, and of course, those are the two. I don't even know, most people who critique or criticize the project haven't read the whole project. That's clear from the criticism. But the two essays that they focus the most on are kind of these two vaulted ideas of America, which is we are the freest, most liberatory country the world has ever seen, and capitalism is the greatest and freest, most economic system the world has ever seen. And I wanted to disband those notions. So I knew each essay had to have an element of surprise. We couldn't tell stories that people like criminal justice is, people aren't that surprised to learn that criminal justice could be traced to slavery, but they are surprised to think about democracy, transportation, our political system in some ways. So that's what I really hoped to do, was give people I don't know how old the people are on this talk, but one of my favorite movies is The Matrix. And I often say that I wanted the 1619 Project to serve as the red pill. So you can go about your life in America and never have to have any understanding of all the coding and architecture that's built the society that we live in. But if you read the 1619 Project, suddenly you can't see your country the same way anymore. You have to be confronted with that upon which it was built. And until that happens, we're never going to be able to have long-term efforts to bring about equality because there's just too much denial and too much erasure to allow that to be possible.
Yeah, it's funny as you were mentioning that the red pill. There's two red pill moments that jump to mind for me from the project. One was the meeting that, and this may be widely known. I'm just not the history buff I should be, but was the meeting with Abraham Lincoln and the five kind of delegates at the White House. And
It's not widely known.
yeah, that
Yeah.
blew my mind. And I'm curious if you, being kind of a student of history, just kind of had this arsenal, for lack of a better word, of these stories you knew weren't kind of in the zeitgeist and needed to be told, or if that was really the collective pooling of all the writers who you involved in the project.
Yeah, it was both. I had for most of the essays, I assigned them, and most of the essays, I had some idea I wanted to go in this general area. But then each one of the scholars or writers um, ended up doing all of this research that blew my mind as well, right? So it's like it's one thing to have kind of a general knowledge about an area, but then to have someone really delve into it. So, for instance, the piece on healthcare that Janine did, I assigned that because I wanted a piece that showed why we're the only Western industrialized country without universal health care, and how our anti-Blackness that we can't get over actually hurts all Americans, right? There are millions of white Americans who also can't go to the doctor if they're sick. And we are, we stand out amongst all of the Western democracies that we like to compare ourselves to. But I hadn't ever read anything on the Freedmen's hospitals. I hadn't done that research. And so everything in the project, I don't think anyone, even historians of that period of history, can read the entire project and not be surprised by things. And I certainly, for my own essay, I read, well, now that I've revised it, probably 30 books. And I had certain ideas about what I wanted the essay to be, but then the more I read and read, I just was learning things all the time. I also didn't know about that meeting with Lincoln and those five Black leaders until I started researching for the essay. And that's, to me, I think, really why the project has struck a nerve with people in the way that it has, is you just realize there's so much we don't know and understand. And history is both what happened and what we're told happened. And we're fed all of these myths. The most contested part of the 1619 project is 2 paragraphs in my essay about the American Revolution, which says, which apparently, is a radical thought that people who made their living off of slavery, who had their power from slavery, who continued the practice of slavery, somehow could be motivated by slavery. It's actually not shocking if you study the period, but even I was surprised by this. I had never, even someone who's intensely skeptical of American history and narratives, had never spent much time thinking about the American Revolution, and certainly not reading history of the American Revolution. And I just realized that the fact that I could be shocked that, all these Virginia enslavers wanted to, could have been motivated to join a war over slavery, just shows the extent to which we have all bought into these American myths, and how, and of course the backlash shows how deeply powerful people are of these myths.
Yeah, it's funny. I happened to go to the University of Virginia undergrad, and I remember Monticello was almost like a pilgrimage site for eager fans of Thomas Jefferson. And since reading the 1619 Project, I can't help but view it in a totally different lens from now knowing this other history. I mean, knowing the story of what happened there. It was a forced labor camp. And it's so remarkable to have some of these stories out, I think, into starting to make their way into mainstream conversations. And another thing in the project that I love was trying to parse a lot of these subtler stories that are part of the American story. The North maybe was enlightened in their own way. And you talk about, one of the essays is obviously about Wall Street and the financing of Black bodies and the slavery kind of industry or as a whole. And I think that was such a subtle, is probably not the word, but just a reframe that I had never been aware of.
Yeah.
And even more recently, the land, leases that are used, banks use maliciously to take land from Black farmers today. And so I guess I'm curious how you thought about like almost like picking which targets to go after, or if you even did that, because it just seems like this rich pool of history that needs to be told. How did you kind of even decide, what to include and what not to?
Yeah. So it printed in a magazine, so there was not unlimited space like you could have online. And we actually ran that edition of the magazine at twice the normal length of the magazine, and still couldn't fit everything we would want in there. So when I got the green light to pursue the project, the very first thing I did was email nearly 2 dozen scholars whose work I've read and whose work has influenced me: historians, sociologists, economists, art historians. And we convened a massive brainstorming session at the New York Times. And I told them the conceit that this was a project commemorating the 400th anniversary of slavery, but that every essay had to start with modern America, that we wanted to find stories today, institutions today that people would be surprised to learn have a connection to slavery. And we just did a big brainstorm. We had a whole whiteboard just full of ideas. Like I said, I basically knew music, capitalism, and democracy were going to be in the project no matter what. And then everything else came from those brainstorming sessions. And we just winnowed the list down until we thought we had kind of our strongest, most surprising cases. And then we went from there. And now with the expansion for the 1619 Project book that's coming out in the fall, we've now added 8 new essays, all of them except my new essay written by historians, to even cover areas that I always knew were whole. So there's no essay in the original project about settler colonialism. Well, clearly you can't deal with slavery without dealing with Indian removal, because Indian removal is what allows the expansion of cotton and the expansion of slavery, right? But we didn't deal with that in the original project, namely because I couldn't figure out the right story to tell that kind of fit the conceit. But now we've got that. And we also don't deal with kind of the larger Americas in the 1619 Project. So the fact that, because America is so America-centric, we're taught about the 13 colonies as if they're not connected to all these other colonies in the Caribbean, English colonies and otherwise, and that more Africans are actually being sent to other parts of the Americas than the United States. So we have a piece now that's actually connecting the Haitian Revolution to what happens in the United States. So that's kind of the benefit. But we could produce I don't know how many more 1619 magazines that all have the same conceit and are all touching all of these different aspects of American life, because again, despite our kind of national denial of the fact, America was, slavery was the foundational institution in this country for the majority of this country. We also forget that we had slavery here longer than we've had freedom.
Yeah, and there's and by the way, anyone who's on the call, I want to encourage you to keep submitting questions to the Q&A, and I'll leave some time at the end and read them. But one thing I've with writing that often happens is as you go to write something, you think you've got the idea, but something else kind of emerges or evolves from it. And one thesis that I've just found so powerful, this thread at the core of the 1619 Project, is that Black Americans are the perfecters of democracy, for some of the reasons we've chatted about now, but obviously so many more reasons. And I'm curious if that's something you kind of came in with a sense of, or if a lot of the core ideas evolved as you all went about really putting this project together.
Yeah, I mean, this is the beauty of all journalism, but I think particularly long form journalism, where you can really take a long period of time to research and think about something, is as you're researching and writing to edify other people, you ultimately end up edifying yourself as well. And so I knew I was going to do an essay on democracy and Black Americans as democratizers, but I was really thinking about it as being around the civil rights movement. So 40s to 1960s, and the role that Black people played in really building democracy through getting all of this, these laws mandating equality through the law. It wasn't until then I started really researching and reading all these books on Black people and democracy, and reading the footnotes, right? Because if you research, you also obsessively read the footnotes of things that you're reading, that I began to understand, well, wait a minute, our efforts at democratizing this country go back way further than that. And in fact, that is the primary role that Black Americans have played. It wasn't our brute labor, it was actually, from the 1600s, and then at the time of the revolution, really pushing this country to live up to its founding ideals, but also fighting this country, right? Dying to force this country to actually democratize. And that was not how I conceived of the essay at the beginning. That really came from just studying. And you have these moments when sometimes they come when you're reading, sometimes they come when you're writing, where you just make these connections. And I'm still making connections. When you all hopefully will get the 1619 book and read the revised essays, all the original essays have been significantly expanded. I've made even more connections since then that I didn't make when I wrote the original essay. And certainly, I did not set out to write a patriotic essay. I didn't set out to think about my own sense of patriotism or my family's, or the role that Black Americans have played as, to me, the most American of Americans. That wasn't what I planned to do at all with the writing, but that's where the writing ended up.
Yeah, and it's so funny of if there's any ideas that have really just latched on me in a way that it is so difficult to shake. It is that this notion of, the beautiful story of when you were a kid drawing the flag of where you're from and connecting that to the true heritage that Black Americans have here. I think that was just, almost this unifying and universally powerful idea that you would hope even people on the fringe could see through to, but
I don't think they read to the end.
Yeah,
I'm like, that's at the very end of the essay, and it's pretty clear they're not reading to the end.
Yeah, I don't know if Mitch McConnell got all the way there, but we'll talk about him later. Well, cool. Maybe just kind of one more question that on my end, and then we'll get to some of the Q&A that's coming in. We have a member in our kind of writing community, Linda Chavers, she's a lecturer at Harvard. When her mother was a student at, I think, American University, she had a chemistry teacher who told her, Black folks can't learn chemistry.
Okay.
And now, a couple decades later, that guy has a building named after him or some god awful thing. And she was considering writing kind of a piece on, what would be different today, if anything. And I guess I'd be curious to hear from you. You mentioned obviously hope can be, its own problematic emotion, but how do you think about where things are headed? Is there anything that gives you encouragement, and what, critical work remains to be done?
Yeah, so I think that, to be clear, I think hope is useful for other people. Like if you don't have people who are hopeful, you certainly cannot foresee a time where things get better. And obviously, Black Americans under the worst possible circumstances, who couldn't have imagined slavery would end, couldn't have imagined we would end racial apartheid in this country. You had to have people who hoped and believed that could happen. Just for me, I don't find it useful. I find like rage to be my most useful emotion. But I appreciate and respect that we have to have hope. With that said, I never try to predict what will happen, because I don't think we know, but I think history can give us a good clue. And we know that we are in really a battle right now for the identity of this country. We are in a battle to decide whether democracy will stand, which of our instincts as a nation, which we have always had two instincts, one is slavery, one is freedom. And those have always dueled with each other. And sometimes, most times, slavery is one, or the legacy of slavery is one, and occasionally the legacy of freedom is one. So when we look at the fact that for instance, a politician like Nikki Haley, who by all counts was a moderate Republican, as early, as late as 2015, that she has gone fully Trump now, issuing videos against critical race theory, tweeting against 1619 Project, saying Black people are not Black people, Democrats are poverty pimps. Like when you see that change within the party, you see these efforts to introduce the most expansive voter suppression laws since the 1960s. These people who are openly saying, this was a country with a blank slate when Europeans got here. There was nothing here that we needed to learn about. Mitch McConnell, a man whose own wealth derived from the legacy of slavery, saying 1619. You don't have to, I'm not surprised he says he doesn't like 1619 Project, but to say 1619 wasn't an important year, but 1865 was, when you don't get 1865 without 1619. I think what we're seeing though is our country dueling against itself like it always had. And if history is instructive, freedom is not going to win this. We are going to see, we never go back all the way to how things were, certainly. And the life I live is, completely different from the life that my father lived. But forward progress in this country has always been met with an intensive white backlash. And I think because of the demographic shift in our country, we're going to see even a greater intensity than we've seen before. And I'm very worried about it, frankly.
Does it help to have Cheeto McTweeto out of the office, or is this, or do you think that is a nice small win, but there's obviously this deeper root and almost rot?
Yeah, I feel like that's a rhetorical question that you just asked me.
Yeah,
yeah.
Totally.
I mean, obviously, yes, it's nice not to have to deal with that. But by seeing how many millions of Americans still support him, still believe that the election was stolen, even moderate Republicans who are embracing that rhetoric even after Trump is gone, what it shows is what those of us who have written about race in this country our entire careers, what we've long been saying, which is Trump was, Trump didn't create any of this. He's just a manifestation of, like you said, the existing rot that's been there. And what he did do was liberate people to be open about that, where I think under Obama, you don't get Trump without Obama. So we know something broke in people when this Black family went into the White House. We don't want to acknowledge that, but that's true. And so he just liberated people white people, a certain segment of white people, to say and do the things that they already felt, but they felt like they couldn't say out loud before. So that's very worrisome.
100%. Well, I do want to leave plenty of time for this Q&A. And the first one is actually from my beloved fiance, who said, I begged Stu to tell you I'm a fellow alum of the UNCJ school. So congrats.
Yay.
Yeah, Night Chair. Congrats on that. That was exciting news at our house. And she's been a follower and admirer of your work since your time at the News and Observer, and you've had a huge impact on her. So not a question.
That's impressive.
Yeah. Yeah, she's been there since almost day one.
What year was she there?
Oh God. Ultimate fiance question. I think she graduated in 2014. So.
Oh, okay. So you're younger than me. Got it.
Well, I'm an old man at heart. But I guess the next question, Abe, I think I touched on the question of, who do you write for? And I love your distinction between writing for and writing to. So I'm gonna skip to Tasha's question. So, hey, Nikole, thanks so much for sharing and for your inspiring words. What gave you the courage to tell history from a different lens? And what is the most meaningful part of retelling or reframing history for you?
Thank you for that question. I don't think what I do is courageous. I've never thought of what I do as courageous. I just don't know how to do anything else. It's literally why I became a journalist. There was no other reason why I wanted to become a journalist. I wanted to use history to help us understand our country, and I wanted to expose the intentional way that racial inequality is implemented and sustained today. But I don't think it's courageous. What was the second part of that question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, the second part was, what's been the most kind of meaningful part of retelling history or reframing history, for you?
Yeah, the most meaningful part is all of the people who engage with the work in good faith, even those who ultimately don't agree with the arguments, when they say, I just didn't know this before, when they're like, wow, I had no idea, and it helps me understand things. That to me, I mean, that's why I'm a journalist. I'm a journalist because I feel like, Ida B. Wells, my spiritual godmother, said that people must know before they can act, and there's no educator like the press. And I truly believe that um, if we don't understand what this is built on, how can we dismantle the parts of it that we think are unfair? And so when people make those connections, and when they tell me that I help them make those connections, it just affirms why I do what I do.
That's fantastic. It segues nicely looking into the future with Anya's question. Which new essay, if you're able to share, are you most excited about?
Mm. Mm, that's a good question. Um, they're all so good, but I would say the two I'm probably most excited about are Carol Anderson is doing an essay, or has done an essay on Second Amendment, and who really, the roots of the Second Amendment in slavery, and who really has the right to bear arms in this country, which will be surprising to no one that's not Black people. And then we have a piece that is, I mentioned earlier, that's connecting the Haitian Revolution to the fear of Black people in this country. And I'm really excited about that because we never learn anything about the Haitian Revolution, and that's very intentional. The Haitian Revolution was the first time in the history of the world that enslaved people overthrew their masters and founded their own nation. Haiti was the first free Black republic in the world. And we don't learn anything about that. We learn about the French Revolution, but we erase the Haitian Revolution. And there's a reason for that, because the Haitian Revolution, of course, which comes after the American Revolution, once again reveals the glaring hypocrisy of the United States, because our revolution was premised on the idea of freedom, but the Haitian Revolution was actually about the idea of freedom. It liberated the enslaved people. So I'm really excited about that, because I just think most Americans have never, they know nothing about the Haitian Revolution, and also the way that ultimately made life harder for Black people in this country. But I'm excited about all of them. Ibram Kendi has he has the second to the last essay in the book, and he's really getting at this idea of progress, and how Americans really become paralyzed by this sense of progress, because we're always looking forward and backwards, so we don't have to deal with the problems right now. So we can say, well, things were bad back then, but they're not as bad as they were back then now, and they'll be better in the future. So then it just allows us to tolerate the inequality that we live in right now. And it's a brilliant essay. So I'm telling you guys, these new essays are going to be amazing. And the last thing I'll just say quickly, my preface is really about memory, national memory, and really getting at some of the controversy and criticism of the project, and what the difference between history and memory, and how so much of the fight over the project is not really about the historical facts in the project, but it's about how does it make us think about our country. And it's never been through the lens of Black people, and many people are uncomfortable with that.
Beautifully said. And I guess I'd love to maybe end on this question from Michael Jones, which is obviously thanks for your time and work. But how do you choose which feedback to engage with and what to ignore? Because I very related to maybe what you just said, but I'll leave it at that.
um, so if you happen to follow me on Twitter, you will notice a market change in my engagement. I took a Twitter sabbatical, and it was really after a particularly ugly moment when the right had started writing all these things about me, and my daughter was reading comments that were calling me racial slurs and misogynistic terms, and I was just like, I have to. She's old enough to Google and search for things. I just have to take a step back. And I think part of me is I don't think of myself as a big name. Like I really do think of myself still in some ways as that journalist with 300 followers that nobody really knew. And so if anyone says anything, I always feel like I should engage. Like I never wanted to be that person where I choose whom I engage with based on how many followers they have, because when I had 300 followers, I was the same person. I had, if my insights are worthy now, they were worthy when no one knew who I was. But that it's gotten me into trouble, and so I found myself arguing with people, and my friends would be like, "Why are you arguing with this nobody?" And I'm like, "Because I was a nobody. That's why." But now I really don't engage at all in that way. And after I took my sabbatical, I really decided if I was going to use Twitter, I had to use it for my purposes. And instead, I was allowing people to draw me in for their purposes. And they were drawing me in ways that I don't think were beneficial to my work. So now I tweet what I want to tweet, and then I let people argue back and forth in my mentions, and I rarely engage now. And I've decided, even with some of my bigger platform critics, my work speaks for itself. I'm not debating. I'm not arguing. They can write what they want about my work, but if people want to know where I stand on things, or want to judge whether my arguments are sound, they can judge that from my very well thought out, revised, historically researched work, and not from me debating with people on Twitter. But I'm 45, and it took me till 6 months ago to learn that lesson.
Yeah, that should be. I guess we're not all. We don't all have the spotlight you do, but I can't imagine the utter moronic stuff you probably have to see on Twitter. But God help you. Well, okay, final question, because we've got a couple of questions about your new book, and I think there's maybe a couple. I know the 1619 Project has books coming out. At least I know there's a children's book that's either out or about to be out. But where can folks kind of follow along with or pre-order the books that are kind of in the works?
Yes. So ultimately, we will produce 7 1619 Project books, and 2 of them are coming out this fall in November. The adult book, which again features expanded versions of all of the original essays, plus 8 new essays, and 36 works of poetry and short fiction. That comes out in November. And our children's book, which is kind of based on the ending story of my democracy essay of a child being ashamed because she didn't know who she was, and learning that she's American, and that's fine. And that also comes out the same time as the adult book. And those books can be pre-ordered anywhere that you purchase books. Support your independent bookstores, though, if you can. And if you want more information about the books, 1619books.com is the website. And I will say, Nikki Haley and Mitch McConnell are doing me a service right now with book sales. So as long as they want to keep talking about the project, I think open-minded Americans will want to read about it for themselves. So I thank anyone for supporting the books.
Hey man, there's very few types of actual bad press. I'm glad that they're moving units for you. Well, Nikole, it was just such an honor and a privilege to host you, and I'm so grateful for your work and for you making the time. So thank you for stopping by.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone.
Fantastic. See everybody. Thanks.